Actually, I think a global education is not possible. Exactly why the question global is so urgent and perhaps it's the most urgent question for universities is the word global. Another way to say that is it's a challenge to every concept of education we have. So we can't speak about global education. To be more clear about that, we could talk about global education in a more colonial moment where a very powerful school could imagine that its interests extended across the world and that its students came from around the world and that its concepts could be applied around the world. So one could imagine an age of global education. We are at the end of that age. I should in a way start at the beginning again, because what I'm saying is you can define global education. It's a previous epoch. It's the epoch we're just leaving behind. This is a really interesting question, because even if we were all to say the question of the global is the question for university, that also means the global is that which we don't know yet, we don't understand. That's why it should be the subject of our research. So I would assume that there are subjects that are not global, but that doesn't mean that they're smaller, doesn't mean that they're local. It might even mean that they are subjects that actually, in a way, start to define a world even beyond the global. So I think that the world we live in now, too easily described as globalized, in a certain sense that world is just our attempt to understand what's going on from a previous paradigm. So from a previous paradigm we say global. That's our way to handle it. When universities have figured out what's going on, probably a different language emerges, and in that moment certain subjects which don't seem very portable suddenly seem super relevant. Another way to say that is global doesn't mean, for me, the world outside the university, the big wide world. Global is a word we use to describe a transformation in the geometry. It's a way of saying that the world doesn't have the shape that we used to think it had. So we used to think it was round, a sphere, and you're sitting on one point of the sphere, and the world would be the whole sphere, and depending on how far you go, you go a long way away. The word globalization refers to the fact that the world doesn't have the geometry of a sphere, that there are millions of worlds that all overlap in extraordinarily complicated ways, so that your relationship to somebody who's theoretically on the other side of what used to be called the world is actually the person you're closest to. So basically the thought of the globe of globalization is the thought that the world is no longer a sphere. And you remember the idea that the world is a sphere was pretty radical when it first came along. I think the thought of globalization is as radical to the sphere theory of the world as the sphere was to the flat world. And it's not by chance that flatness is actually a big part of globalization, right? So I just think it's wonderful that we could be in this moment imagining that the geometry of our planet has been completely transformed, and eventually universities will figure out what that means. It might mean, by the way, since the world is clearly changing more quickly than universities, it might mean that all the work that universities do on globalization is historical, like it already happened. And that's not a bad thing. Columbia is in New York, and it's of New York, which means the university itself is an immigrant. It's been in New York for a while, 275 years, but it shares with every other immigrant the sense of changing direction. So what arrives here, literally with royal seal of approval, is a refugee from the intellectual legacy of the university going back, a very long way. But in New York, every immigrant changes direction, changes speed, is redefined is energized by the people around you who are also changing speed. And in New York, you're only as good as what comes out of your mouth. And universities were always based on the idea that you're only as good as whatever comes out of your mouth being the same as what came out of anybody else's mouth, like your teacher's mouth. So New York is so thoroughly global already from the beginning that we're really in a unique position to participate in thinking about the way in which, one of the most obvious effects of globalization, this word we use too easily, but one of those effects is to render us all eternally immigrants, because we no longer occupy a space one could call home from which one travels to something that could be called the world. In many ways, our own home is what we understand the least, and what we understand the most is the so-called world. So globalization is also the moment in which you feel like an immigrant, which means there's fear there and fragility, but there's also great hope and great optimism, but also just an incredible sense of tenderness towards those who have welcomed you. So that, for example, those who have been made welcome on this island in New York, never forget that, and never forget the trust shown in them. So imagine a world in which we are all immigrants, and all of us not able to take our home for granted, having to, as it were, participate in its definition, and feeling a great tenderness to all of those around us. So actually, this will no doubt seem like what it is, an extraordinary piece of New York, arrogance. But New York's not alone in being an immigrant city, and if you take the immigrant cities of the world and say, what if those are more or less models for what everyday life is, what a beautiful world that would be. In putting that same analogy, and it's not even an analogy, it's a reality. This is an immigrant university in an immigrant city that has grown up with the city, has its own history now and its own dignity, and is sort of thoroughly New York, but is thoroughly and always thinking about all travelers. The most obvious example of that are our students who are immigrants to New York, who are here for a year or 2 years or 3 years or 7 years, and their life will change here. They will be as good as what comes out of their mouth here. They will not be respected for their ability to repeat what others have said. They will be expected to be those that will say new things in new ways. So in a way, every educational program has to have in it something like the hospitality of New York. In other words, every teacher has to welcome every student and make them feel noble. And so it's the opposite of preaching. It's giving your student an invitation to change the way we think. Another way to say this, just an invitation to talk. And in New York it's just talk, talk, talk. So this is a very slow answer to your question. So Columbia has a really special advantage in thinking globalization, and I would say a huge responsibility because of that. We are not hiding out in the countryside or in a small town. We are in the middle of urban transformation and participating in a transformation that's now global. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.